They said the law would protect me. I believed it, until the night it didn't. A simple drive home turned into a battle I never saw coming. Now, I'm risking everything, my career, my safety, and the fragile bond with my son, to expose the cracks in a broken system. But this fight isn't just mine. The question is, how far will I go before the system fights back? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. I rolled my shoulders and sighed as I slid into my car, the courtroom's fluorescent hum still ringing faintly in my ears. It had been another long day, 3 hearings, 2 motions, and a jury selection that had dragged on well past lunch. These moments, when I finally turned the key in the ignition and let the purr of my sedan fill the air, were my sanctuary. The courtroom demanded precision and authority. Here, in the quiet cocoon of my car, I could just be Arya. The evening had stretched into a soft twilight, the sky painted in shades of lavender and gold. My favorite part of the day. The city streets thinned as commuters made their way home, and I followed the familiar route back to my suburban neighborhood. For a moment, my mind wandered to Jordan. My son had been quiet lately, his usual chatter replaced by grunts and sighs. Teenage years, I told myself, but the ache in my chest said it was more than that. The house felt different these days. A void. Since Marcus left, it was just the 2 of us, and I could sense Jordan drifting farther away. I tried to bridge the gap with family dinners and late-night talks, but I always found myself reaching for a boy who seemed just out of my grasp. Maybe tonight will be different, I thought, gripping the wheel a little tighter. The streets grew quieter as I entered the outskirts of the city. The familiar rhythm of tires on asphalt soothed me, and I began to think about tomorrow's docket. A landlord-tenant dispute. A drug possession case. Routine, if exhausting. It was the kind of work I believed in, the small battles that made the larger system work. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but I ignored it. A rule I never broke: no distractions while driving. I slowed at the intersection of Elm and Pine, the quiet street that marked the edge of my neighborhood. The streetlights were just flickering on, their glow washing the pavement in amber. The world felt peaceful. Until it wasn't. A flash of red and blue erupted in my rearview mirror, snapping me out of my thoughts. My heart sank. The kind of sinking that every black person in America knows, no matter who they are or what they've done. I glanced down at the speedometer. 40. The limit. My seatbelt was fastened, and I had stopped fully at the last sign. A dozen scenarios raced through my mind, each one less plausible than the last. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, and pulled to the side of the road. The cruiser rolled to a stop behind me. Its headlights blazed, turning my reflection in the mirror into a ghostly image. My hand stayed on the wheel, my breathing steady but shallow. "You've done nothing wrong," I reminded myself. But the cold grip of unease didn't loosen. The officer approached slowly, his silhouette growing sharper with every step. White male, early 30s, with the kind of practiced posture that suggested authority, if not arrogance. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered gun, a detail I noticed immediately. "License and registration," he said, his voice clipped and low. He hadn't even greeted me. I forced a calm smile. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what this is about?" His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, he didn't respond. The silence stretched. Then, finally, "License. Registration." My pulse quickened, but I kept my face neutral. I reached for my glove compartment, narrating each movement the way my father had taught me when I first learned to drive. "Always show them you have nothing to hide." I handed over the documents, my fingers brushing his gloved hand. He glanced at them, his eyes narrowing slightly when they landed on my name. "Judge Bennett, huh?" The words dripped with something I couldn't quite name: skepticism? Disdain? Nice car you've got here. I stayed silent. Words, in moments like these, were as likely to harm as to help. You know why I stopped you? He asked, finally meeting my gaze. No, officer. Could you please tell me? You were speeding. And you didn't make a full stop at the last intersection. It was a lie. I knew it, and I suspected he did too. But arguing wasn't an option. I'd spent years telling clients the same thing, don't escalate. I nodded, my hands gripping the wheel. I see. I'll be more mindful. He didn't move. His eyes roamed over the car, lingering on the leather seats, the briefcase in the back, the clean lines of the dashboard. Step out of the vehicle, he said abruptly. I froze. Is that necessary, officer? Step out. Now. His tone left no room for negotiation. My fingers trembled as I unbuckled my seatbelt. As I stepped out onto the pavement, the chill of the evening air bit at my skin. The officer motioned for me to stand by the hood. His hand still hovered near his gun. He began to search the car, opening compartments and looking under seats. He even checked the trunk, rifling through my belongings as though expecting something incriminating to fall out. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter with each passing second. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about power. When he finally returned, he held out my license and registration without meeting my eyes. You're free to go, he muttered, his tone flat. That's all? I asked, my voice steady but edged with indignation. My hands were trembling now, though I kept them at my sides. That's all, he said, turning back to his cruiser without another word. As I slid back into my car, the weight of what had just happened hit me. I had been stopped for nothing. Searched for nothing. Dismissed as though my existence was an inconvenience. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I drove the rest of the way home, my mind racing. This wasn't just a bad cop or a bad night. This was a system. And for the first time, it had found its way to my doorstep. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I locked the door behind me, my hands still trembling. I stood there for a moment, staring at the polished wood floors I had scrubbed clean a few weekends ago. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like I had stepped into a parallel world where none of what had just happened existed. But it had happened. My chest felt tight, and I exhaled slowly, willing the tension to leave my body. It didn't work. Mom? Jordan's voice came from upstairs, sleepy and muffled. That you? Yes, it's me. Go back to bed, I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. I needed a moment. Just one. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, my movements deliberate. The sharp clang of the glass against the counter snapped me back to the present. I hadn't noticed how hard my grip was. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window over the sink. The face looking back was the same one I had seen every morning, composed, confident, unshakable. But tonight, cracks showed around the edges. I traced a finger along my temple, noticing how deep the lines there had grown. I had spent my life believing in the system. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but I thought it could be fixed from within. I had built my career on that belief, pouring everything into my work as a judge. I thought I was immune to the injustices I saw in my courtroom every day, shielded by my title, my position, my dedication to the law. Tonight proved me wrong. The images came flooding back, the officer's hand hovering over his gun, his eyes narrowing as he scanned my license, the sneer in his voice when he mentioned my car. I'd spent years telling others not to let anger control them in moments like this, but now, I wasn't sure how to control my own. I sipped the water and let it cool my throat, my mind racing. I thought about the people who had sat in front of me in court, recounting their own stories of mistreatment. Stories I had listened to with a mix of empathy and distance. I'd always believed them, but I'd never truly felt what they felt, until now. I walked into the living room, sank onto the couch, and stared at the family photos on the wall. There we were, Jordan and I, smiling at the camera, his arm wrapped around my shoulder. He had my eyes and his father's stubbornness. I wondered if he would ever have to face what I had tonight. The thought chilled me to my core. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. I picked it up, expecting a late-night reminder from a colleague or an update on tomorrow's cases. Instead, it was an email from the courthouse, a routine schedule update. As I read the lines, the absurdity of it hit me. Tomorrow, I would walk into that building, robe on, gavel in hand, and preside over cases where people sought justice. All while knowing that tonight, justice had been absent when I needed it most. I put the phone down and stared at it for a long time. A question lingered in the air, one I couldn't ignore: what was I going to do about this? Footsteps sounded on the stairs, soft but insistent. Jordan appeared, his hair tousled and his face scrunched in half-sleep. "You're still up?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Couldn't sleep," I said, forcing a smile. "What about you?" He shrugged and plopped onto the arm of the couch. "Heard you come in. You okay? You look stressed." I hesitated. How much could I tell him? Jordan was old enough to understand, but not old enough to carry the weight of what I had just experienced. I didn't want to scare him. "I'm fine," I said finally. "Just had a long day." "Something happen?" His eyes searched mine, sharp and perceptive. I hated how much he could see through me. "Nothing you need to worry about," I said softly. "Go back to bed. It's late." He stared at me for a moment, then sighed and stood. "You always say that," he muttered under his breath as he walked back upstairs. The words stung more than I cared to admit. Alone again, I sat in silence, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. The officer's words replayed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Nice car you've got here." It wasn't a compliment, it was a reminder. A reminder that in his eyes, I didn't belong behind the wheel of a car like mine. I didn't belong in that quiet suburb. I didn't belong in the image of success I had worked so hard to build. I thought about what to do next. Filing a formal complaint felt obvious but insufficient. Would it matter? Would anyone care? The system was built to protect itself, not people like me. I knew that better than anyone. And yet, I couldn't let it go. I thought about the young man I'd sentenced earlier that day, charged with resisting arrest after a traffic stop much like mine. He'd sat across from me, his voice trembling as he recounted how the officers had dragged him out of his car and pinned him to the ground. I'd believed him, but I had still sentenced him within the bounds of the law. Tonight, I felt like I owed him something. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had sat in my courtroom, every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. I couldn't let this pass. I grabbed a notebook from the coffee table and flipped it open. The blank page stared back at me, daring me to fill it. My pen hovered for a moment before I began to write, the words flowing faster than I could think. Date, Friday evening, 9:45 p.m. Location, intersection of Elm and Pine. Officer, Ethan Cole. Incident, traffic stop without cause, unwarranted search of vehicle. The list grew longer as I detailed every moment of the stop. The officer's tone, his body language, the words he had chosen. I documented everything, knowing it might be the only power I had. When I finally put the pen down, the clock on the wall read 2 a.m. I felt drained but resolute. The system I believed in might be broken, but it was the only one we had. And I wasn't going to let it break me. This fight wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had been wronged by the people who were supposed to protect them. If I didn't stand up, who would? I closed the notebook, set it on the coffee table, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, I would begin. The courthouse loomed ahead, its pale stone facade catching the soft morning sunlight. A familiar sight, yet today it felt different, almost imposing. I parked my car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My stomach churned with a cocktail of unease and determination. The notebook from last night sat on the passenger seat, pages filled with every detail of my encounter. This was my armor, thin as it might be, against the injustice I was about to confront. My phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. A text from Marcus Washington, an old friend and a civil rights attorney. If you're serious about this, I'll be here every step of the way. Let me know when you want to meet. I smiled faintly. Marcus always had my back, but this was a fight I needed to start on my own. At least for now. The interior of the courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, attorneys clutching bulging briefcases, clerks scurrying between offices, and the occasional defendant standing awkwardly in too tight suits. I moved through the familiar corridors, my heels clicking sharply on the polished floors. People nodded in greeting, their expressions warm and professional. None of them knew what I carried with me. The Internal Affairs office was tucked in a quieter corner, far from the courtroom drama that often unfolded nearby. The receptionist, a young woman with dark hair tied in a sleek bun, looked up as I approached. "Judge Bennett," she said with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat for a moment. Then, with a steadying breath, I said, "I'd like to file a formal complaint." Her smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of practiced neutrality. "Of course. Let me get you a form." She handed me a clipboard with a thick packet of papers. I scanned the pages, noting the sections for incident details, officer identification, and supporting evidence. As I sat in the waiting area, pen poised over the first line, a wave of uncertainty washed over me. Was this the right move? Would it even make a difference? I shook the thoughts away. I'd spent the entire night replaying the incident in my mind, my emotions fluctuating between anger and resolve. If I didn't act, I'd be complicit in allowing this to happen again, not just to me, but to others without my platform or privilege. The pen moved steadily across the page as I detailed every moment of the stop, the flashing lights in my rearview mirror, the officer's cold demeanor, his baseless accusations, and the invasive search of my car. I included how I'd felt, humiliated, afraid, and powerless. For someone who had spent her career wielding the gavel of justice, that powerlessness stung the most. By the time I finished, the receptionist was back. She took the packet with a professional nod, assuring me the matter would be reviewed. Her tone was calm, but I detected something else in her expression, something close to pity. As I left the office, a familiar voice called out behind me. "Judge Bennett?" I turned to see Daniel Carter, a colleague from the bench. His brow furrowed as he approached, his leather briefcase swinging by his side. "Everything all right?" "Yes, fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just handling some personal business." Daniel tilted his head, studying me. He was older, with silver hair and a demeanor that often straddled the line between fatherly and overbearing. "You don't look fine. You look rattled. What's going on?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "I filed a complaint against an officer. Last night, I was pulled over and treated like," I stopped myself, shaking my head. "It doesn't matter." I had to say something. Daniel's face darkened, and he glanced around the corridor before lowering his voice. "Arya, be careful. This kind of thing, it can get messy. You don't want to make enemies in the wrong places." I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze. "If speaking the truth makes me enemies, so be it. I won't stay silent about what happened." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Just, Watch your back, he said before walking away. Back in my chambers, the weight of what I had done began to settle in. My desk, usually piled high with case files, now seemed starkly empty. I stared at the nameplate, Honorable Judge Aria Bennett, as if it might offer some reassurance. Instead, it felt like a reminder of how much I stood to lose. The door opened, and my assistant, Melinda, peeked in. "You have a call from Marcus Washington," she said, holding up the phone. I sighed and gestured for her to put it through. "Marcus," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You've got great timing." "You knew I'd call," he replied, his tone a mix of warmth and concern. "I heard what you did. News travels fast. It always does when someone like you decides to take on the system." His voice softened. "How are you holding up?" I paused, considering the question. "I'm fine. Angry, but fine." "Good. Hold on to that anger. You'll need it." Marcus's voice grew serious. "But you know this isn't going to be easy, right? They'll push back. Hard." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. I wasn't sure if I truly understood the scale of what I'd just set into motion. "Well, when you're ready, let's talk strategy," Marcus said. "I'll help you fight this the right way. You're not alone in this, Aria." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I presided over 2 cases, my mind only half present as I listened to arguments and weighed evidence. In the back of my mind, the complaint lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. That evening, as I drove home, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. My name stared back at me from the screen, the headline bold and unmissable. "Respected judge files complaint against officer for racial profiling." My stomach dropped. The story had leaked. By the time I reached my driveway, my phone was buzzing non-stop with calls and messages. Some were from colleagues, others from reporters. The lines between personal and public had blurred, and there was no turning back now. I sat in the car, staring at the glow of the dashboard. My hands trembled slightly, but my resolve hardened. They would try to intimidate me, to silence me, but I wouldn't let them. This wasn't just about me anymore. The news hit like a thunderclap. By morning, my name was everywhere, plastered across headlines, whispered in hallways, and trending on social media. I scrolled through my phone at the breakfast table, each article and comment weighing heavier than the last. Judge takes a stand against racial profiling. Can the legal system police itself? A traffic stop sparks a firestorm. The words stared back at me, bold and unflinching. Yet it wasn't the articles themselves that stung the most, it was the comments beneath them. Typical race card play. She's a judge. She should know better than to make a fuss. Probably speeding and now looking for attention. My grip tightened on the phone as the bile rose in my throat. I told myself not to read them, but I couldn't stop. Each comment was like a tiny dagger, chipping away at my resolve. Across the table, Jordan sat silently, picking at his cereal. He hadn't said much since the story broke. I could feel the distance between us like a chasm, widening with every passing moment. "You're quiet," I said, breaking the silence. He shrugged without looking up. "It's all over my feed," he muttered. "People are talking about you." "And what are they saying?" He hesitated, then put down his spoon. "That you're making trouble. That you're trying to start something where there's nothing." His eyes finally met mine, a mix of frustration and worry. "Why'd you have to do this, Mom?" His words hit harder than any headline. "Because it's the right thing to do," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What happened to me wasn't okay, and it's not okay when it happens to anyone else. If I don't speak up, who will? But now everyone's watching you," he said, his voice rising. What if something happens? What if they come after you?" I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. Jordan, I know this is scary. It's scary for me too. But sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks. And this? This is bigger than me. He pulled his hand away, his jaw tightening. I just don't want to lose you, he said softly, then grabbed his backpack and left for school. The door closed, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the growing weight of what I had set into motion. The courthouse felt different that day. The usual buzz of activity seemed muted, as if everyone was holding their breath. As I walked through the halls, conversations hushed, and eyes darted away when I glanced in their direction. In my chambers, Melinda was waiting with a stack of case files. Her smile was tight, her usual warmth replaced by a thin veneer of professionalism. "You've had a few calls this morning," she said, placing the files on my desk. "Most of them reporters." "Let them wait," I replied, sinking into my chair. "There was one from Judge Carter," she added, hesitating. I looked up. "And?" She fidgeted with the edge of her notebook. "He suggested that you might want to reconsider how public you're being about this." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Of course he did. That afternoon, I received a call from Marcus. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, his tone half amused, half concerned. "That's putting it lightly," I replied. "Arya, you need to be ready for what's coming," he said. "This isn't just about filing a complaint anymore. The system is going to close ranks. They'll do everything they can to discredit you." I expected that, I said, though the knot in my stomach told a different story. "Have you thought about speaking to the press?" he asked. "No," I said firmly. "This isn't about me. I don't want to make this a spectacle. Arya, whether you like it or not, you're already the center of this story. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will." I was silent for a moment, staring at the papers scattered across my desk. "Let me think about it," I said finally. By the end of the day, the whispers had turned into full-blown conversations. As I left the courthouse, I overheard snippets of dialogue in the corridors. "She's got guts, I'll give her that. Guts, or a death wish. She's going to regret this. Watch." The words lingered as I stepped into the parking lot. My car sat under the fading sunlight, a symbol of the life I had built, and the life I was now risking. I climbed in and drove home, the silence in the car deafening. When I pulled into the driveway, Jordan's bike was propped against the porch railing. A small comfort. Inside, the house was quiet. I found Jordan in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," I said softly, sitting down next to him. He didn't look up. "I know this is hard for you," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But I need you to understand why I'm doing this." He finally glanced at me, his expression guarded. "You think they'll actually do anything? You think filing a complaint will change anything?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But doing nothing definitely won't." He was quiet for a long moment, then said, I don't want them to hurt you." The vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. I reached for his hand, and this time, he didn't pull away. "They won't," I said, more to reassure him than myself. "I promise." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. The pages were filled with notes, dates, and ideas for what came next. My phone buzzed with another news alert. This time, it wasn't just about me. The headline read, "Civil rights leaders rally behind Judge Bennett's fight." A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. Maybe I wasn't alone in this. Maybe this fight was bigger than I had imagined. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the quiet street. The battle ahead would be long and hard, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of something stronger than fear, determination. The morning of the rally dawned with a heavy gray sky, the kind that threatened rain but couldn't quite muster the strength to follow through. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. The face looking back at me felt unfamiliar, stoic, composed, yet weighed down by something intangible. I had spoken in courtrooms, in front of juries, but this was different. This wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration. Jordan sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone as I walked into the living room. "Are you coming?" I asked. He looked up, his brows furrowing. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's important to me." He hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay." We arrived at the park just as the crowd began to gather. Signs bobbed above the sea of heads, bearing slogans like, "Justice for all" and "End racial profiling now." The air buzzed with energy, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Reverend Sarah Hughes spotted me from across the stage and waved me over. Her presence was commanding, her voice warm and steady as she greeted me. "Judge Bennett, I'm so glad you're here. The people need to see you." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you for inviting me." She placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You're going to do great. Just speak from the heart." Jordan hovered near the edge of the stage, his arms crossed. I gave him a small smile, but he didn't return it. Instead, he turned his gaze to the crowd, his expression unreadable. The speeches began, each one punctuated by cheers and applause. Community leaders, activists, and even a few local politicians took the stage, their words weaving a tapestry of frustration and hope. When Reverend Hughes introduced me, the applause was polite but measured. I stepped up to the microphone, my heart hammering in my chest. The crowd stretched before me, their faces expectant. "I'm not here today as a judge," I began, my voice steady despite the nerves clawing at my insides. "I'm here as a black woman who has seen firsthand the ways our system can fail us." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, and I paused, letting the words settle. "Last week, I was pulled over for nothing more than driving while black. I was treated with suspicion, searched without cause, and dismissed as though my rights didn't matter. And I know that my experience is not unique. It happens every day to countless people in this country, people who don't have a title or a platform to fight back." The murmurs turned to applause, growing louder with each sentence. "This isn't just about one officer or one department. This is about a system that has allowed bias and injustice to thrive unchecked. And if we don't stand up, if we don't demand change, it will continue to happen." I paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their eyes alight with determination. Others looked skeptical, their arms crossed as though waiting for me to prove myself. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for justice. And I know that together, we can make it happen. The applause was deafening now, a wave of sound that washed over me. My chest felt lighter, my resolve stronger. I stepped back from the microphone, letting Reverend Hughes take over. As I walked off the stage, Jordan met me at the bottom of the steps. His expression was softer now, his shoulders less tense. "You were good," he said, his voice hesitant. "Thanks," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That means a lot." For the first time in days, he smiled. The rally continued, the energy building with each passing moment. I mingled with the crowd, shaking hands and listening to their stories. People approached me with a mix of gratitude and urgency, eager to share their own experiences of injustice. An older man with weathered hands gripped mine tightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've needed someone like you for a long time." A young woman with tear-streaked cheeks pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "My brother, he didn't survive his encounter with the police. Please, don't stop fighting." Their words stayed with me as the rally wound down, the crowd dispersing into the evening light. Back at home, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me drained but resolute. Jordan sat across from me at the kitchen table, his phone resting face down beside him. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Get what?" "Why you're doing this," he said, meeting my gaze. "It's not just about you." "No, it's not," I said, my voice soft. "It's about all of us. And it's about you, too. I want you to live in a world where this doesn't happen anymore." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're kind of amazing, you know that?" I laughed, the sound light and unexpected. "Thank you, Jordan. That means everything to me." Later that night, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Marcus, with the subject line, "You won't believe this." I opened it, my pulse quickening as I read his message. "Arya, I just found out that Officer Cole has a history of complaints, multiple, in fact. They've been buried by the department, but I'm working on getting the records. This isn't just about your case. This is about something much bigger." My heart raced as I set the phone down. The rally had given me strength, but this? This was fuel. The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined, its plain white walls and sterile lighting a stark contrast to the weight of what was about to happen. A long table stretched across the center, where a panel of officers sat with blank expressions. To their left was a projector screen, flickering with the frozen image of dashcam footage. My car pulled over at the side of the road, Officer Cole's cruiser parked behind it. I adjusted my blazer, my hands steady even as my heart raced. Marcus leaned in close, his voice low and calm. "Remember, stick to the facts. Let the footage speak for itself." I nodded, my mind replaying the meticulous preparation we had done over the past week. Every detail of the stop, every word spoken, every second of the footage had been dissected and woven into a case I hoped was airtight. But the truth was, I wasn't just fighting against Officer Cole, I was fighting against a system designed to protect its own. "Judge Bennett," a deep voice called, breaking my thoughts. Detective Harris, the lead investigator for internal affairs, gestured toward the seat at the table opposite Officer Cole. I glanced at Marcus, who gave me a reassuring nod, and stepped forward. Officer Cole was already seated, his posture stiff and defensive. His attorney, a middle-aged man with a practiced smile, flipped through a stack of notes. Cole glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention to the panel. "Let's begin," Harris said, his tone as neutral as his face. "We're here to review the formal complaint filed by Judge Arya Bennett against Officer Ethan Cole, alleging racial profiling and misconduct during a traffic stop on June 15. We will review evidence, hear testimony from both parties, and determine whether disciplinary action is warranted." I inhaled deeply, my gaze steady as Harris began playing the dashcam footage. The room was silent except for the sound of the video. My car came into view, moving steadily down a quiet street before Officer Cole's flashing lights filled the screen. The audio crackled as his voice barked the first command, "License and registration." My voice, calm but firm, responded. Then the search began, his tone growing sharper with each command. My chest tightened as I watched it all unfold again, this time from the cold, unblinking eye of the camera. It was even more unsettling than I remembered. Every moment, every pause, every word that had cut me down now played out in stark detail for the room to see. When the footage ended, Harris turned to me. "Judge Bennett, would you like to make a statement?" I stood, smoothing my skirt, and faced the panel. Yes, I would. The words I had rehearsed for days flowed naturally, my voice clear and steady. What you just saw was not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a systemic issue that affects countless individuals who don't have the resources or platform to speak out. Officer Cole's actions were not just a violation of my rights, they were a failure of the system that is supposed to protect all citizens. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the room. I'm here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been treated as less than, as suspicious, simply because of the color of their skin. This must stop, and accountability is the first step. The silence that followed was broken by the clink of Officer Cole's attorney adjusting his chair. He stood, straightened his tie, and began his rebuttal. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, he started, his voice smooth and measured. What we saw in that footage was a law enforcement officer performing his duty. Officer Cole acted within his authority to ensure the safety of our community. There is no evidence of racial profiling, only a misunderstanding that has unfortunately escalated to this point. His words were a careful blend of deflection and denial, each one calculated to chip away at my complaint. He dismissed the search as routine and my reaction as emotional, painting Cole as a diligent officer who had been unfairly targeted. As I listened, anger simmered beneath my calm exterior. This wasn't just about Officer Cole anymore, it was about the countless others who had used the same excuses to justify unjust actions. Marcus leaned forward when it was his turn, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let's focus on the facts," he said, his tone sharp. The dashcam footage clearly shows no violation of traffic laws prior to the stop. Officer Cole's decision to search the vehicle was made without probable cause. And let's not ignore the tone and demeanor he exhibited throughout the interaction. If this is what routine looks like, then we have a serious problem. He turned toward the panel, locking eyes with each member. The issue here is not just about one officer's actions. It's about the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. If we allow behavior like this to go unchecked, we erode that trust further. Hours passed as both sides presented their cases. Witnesses were called, policies were cited, and the footage was replayed multiple times. By the end of the hearing, exhaustion weighed on me, but my resolve remained unshaken. The panel announced they would deliberate and deliver their decision shortly. I stepped outside, the crisp air a welcome reprieve from the stifling room. Marcus joined me, his expression guarded. "You did great," he said. "Now we wait." I nodded, crossing my arms as I stared at the courthouse steps. "Do you think they'll do the right thing?" He hesitated, then said, "They'll do what they think will protect themselves. But you made it impossible for them to ignore the truth." The panel reconvened 30 minutes later. My pulse quickened as we filed back into the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Detective Harris cleared his throat. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, Internal Affairs has determined that Officer Cole's actions were inappropriate and a violation of departmental policy. As a result, Officer Cole will be suspended without pay for 3 weeks and required to undergo mandatory retraining." Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but it was fleeting. However, Harris continued, "We have also concluded that Officer Cole's conduct does not rise to the level of criminal misconduct. No further action will be taken." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Suspension? Retraining? That was it? After everything, this was their idea of accountability? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to remain composed. Marcus's hand rested lightly on my arm, a silent reminder to hold steady. But inside, frustration and anger churned. As we left the building, reporters swarmed, their voices a cacophony of questions. I ignored them, my focus laser-sharp on what lay ahead. This was far from over. The system had offered a token gesture, but I wasn't going to stop until real change came. "This isn't justice," I muttered to Marcus as we reached the car. "No, it's not," he said, his voice steady. "But it's a start." I glanced back at the courthouse, its stone facade cold and indifferent. A start wasn't enough, not for me, and not for the countless others who had been silenced. This was just the beginning. The quiet hum of my office offered little solace as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the email from Internal Affairs confirming their decision. Their words echoed in my mind: suspension without pay and mandatory retraining. It was a slap on the wrist, an insult, really, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in a rigged game. My phone buzzed beside me. Another reporter. Another request for a comment. I ignored it, my hand tightening into a fist. The public needed to hear the truth, but I needed a moment to breathe, to think. "Mom?" Jordan's voice called from the doorway, breaking the silence. I looked up to see him standing there, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His face was softer today, his usual guarded expression replaced by something gentler. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "How was school?" "Fine," he said, stepping inside. "But everyone's talking about you. My friends, their parents, even my teachers." I sat up straighter, motioning for him to come closer. "What are they saying?" "Some of them think you're brave," he said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "But others, they think you're making trouble." I exhaled slowly. "And what do you think?" He hesitated, then met my eyes. "I think you're doing what you always tell me to do. Stand up for what's right." My heart swelled, and I reached for his hand. "Thank you, Jordan. That means everything to me." His smile was small but genuine. "So, what happens next?" I didn't have an answer for him, not yet. Later that evening, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the list of supporters Marcus had sent me, an idea began to form. The decision from Internal Affairs wasn't enough, but the momentum we'd built couldn't stop here. People were watching now, listening. I had to give them something to rally behind. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a reporter. It was Reverend Sarah Hughes. Judge Bennett, her warm voice greeted me. "I just heard the news. How are you holding up?" "Frustrated," I admitted. "The decision feels hollow. Like they're just trying to pacify me without addressing the real problem." She hummed in agreement. "That's exactly what they're doing. But this fight isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning." I leaned back in my chair, her words settling over me like a bomb. "What do you suggest?" "We need to take this further," she said, her voice steady. "The community is ready to stand behind you. Let's organize another rally. Not just about your case, but about systemic change. We can push for reforms, real ones." The idea lit a spark inside me. "I'll do it," I said, the weight of the day lifting slightly. "But this time, it needs to be bigger. We need to reach more people." "We will," she promised. "Let's get to work." Over the next few days, the rally came together with a speed that surprised even me. Marcus reached out to civil rights organizations, while Reverend Hughes coordinated with community leaders. My inbox filled with messages of support from people I'd never met, teachers, activists, even a few fellow judges who had once hesitated to speak out. Meanwhile, the backlash grew louder. The police union released a statement condemning me, accusing me of vilifying law enforcement and undermining public trust. Social media turned into a battlefield, with anonymous accounts hurling insults and veiled threats. "You need to be careful," Marcus said during one of our late-night strategy calls. "The more attention this gets, the more they'll try to discredit you." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm not backing down." The day of the rally arrived with a crisp breeze cutting through the autumn air. Hundreds of people gathered in the downtown park, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Signs dotted the crowd, their messages bold and unapologetic: justice for all and enough is enough. I stood behind the stage, my hands clasped tightly as I watched the sea of faces. Jordan was beside me, his presence grounding me in a way nothing else could. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, stepping up beside me. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, taking a deep breath. Reverend Hughes took the stage first, her voice carrying over the crowd like a melody. She spoke about the need for unity, for courage, for change. When she introduced me, the applause was thunderous. I stepped forward, the microphone cool beneath my fingers. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on me. I stand here today not as a judge, but as a mother, a woman, and a citizen who has seen firsthand the cracks in our system, I began. I recounted my story, each word deliberate and measured. But I didn't stop there. I spoke about the countless others who had faced similar injustices, those whose names never made headlines, whose stories were buried beneath bureaucracy and indifference. This isn't just about one officer or one complaint, I said, my voice rising. This is about a system that has allowed injustice to thrive. And we are here today to say, enough. The crowd erupted into applause, their energy surging like a wave. We are not here to tear down. We are here to rebuild. To demand accountability, transparency, and reform. And we will not stop until those demands are met. The cheers that followed were deafening, their echoes ringing in my ears long after I stepped off the stage. That evening, as I sat with Jordan in the quiet of our living room, my phone buzzed with another email. It was from Marcus, with an attachment labeled, Cole's disciplinary record. I opened it, my eyes scanning the pages. The records confirmed what I had suspected. Officer Cole had a history of complaints, all buried under layers of bureaucracy. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing the system that had protected him, and so many others, for far too long. I closed the laptop and leaned back, my mind racing. The rally had been a turning point, but this? This was the key to something bigger. Mom? Jordan's voice pulled me back to the present. I turned to him, my resolve hardening. I'm going to keep fighting, I said. For you. For all of us. His smile was small but filled with pride. I know, he said. And I'm with you.